Have you ever heard the joke about starting an ADHD house cleaning service? Now, if you do not have the same algorithm as me, it goes something like this. Someone says, I'm going to start an ADHD house cleaning service where I don't actually clean the houses. I just call the person with ADHD and tell them I'm coming over in an hour. Now, I love this joke because it's real. When I see it, I laugh. I think I feel a little attacked by this, but also I think this would work. Now, I start off with a joke because one, it is a representation of one of the ways the ADHD brain works. That sense of urgency that somebody's coming over to my house, I finally have to do the thing. But I also think it can help to have a sense of humor around some of the idiosyncrasies about ADHD, because if I'm being honest, there are times when it really doesn't feel funny. There are some days where it's a true struggle and you're wishing things were different and you don't really understand what's going on. And for a long time before I even knew about ADHD, I just thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me. So there are real consequences and real struggles for people who live with ADHD or who are undiagnosed. And a lot of productivity advice works really well for neurotypical brains, but doesn't necessarily work for people with ADHD. And so it makes sense that when I started to share about the momentum formula and a framework that says I'm going to help you to take action, I get why people were hesitant to say and ask that question, does it actually work for people with ADHD? Because a lot of advice just simply does not. And so today's episode is all about ADHD. It is about the momentum formula and its relationship to ADHD, not just how it can help, but also how it's one of the reasons that the formula was ever developed. And one of the first things I want to address as I start off this episode, I want to state upfront I am not an expert on ADHD, and nor do I claim to be. Today, I am speaking from my experience as a person who's been diagnosed with ADHD and as someone who studied neuroscience in university. So I do have a strong baseline and understanding of how the brain works. And so, with that in mind, I want to discuss, kind of take you back in time when this understanding of the brain led me to have an aha moment in May of 2024. I had not been diagnosed yet, but was kind of coming to terms with it. One morning, I was journaling about some recent procrastination, and obviously, I was struggling and I was frustrating. I knew what I needed to do, and I wanted to do it. But on that morning, it was the first time I asked myself, is this emotional procrastination or is this dopamine? You see, for a really long time, I took a very binary approach to being stuck. I assumed, based on my understanding and a framework called immunity to change, that if you were stuck, it was either logical or psychological. Basically, if you wanted to get unstuck, focus on skill set or mindset. It was one or the other. And that's really the way my brain worked. But I hit a point where I thought, this is not a psychological roadblock. I know exactly what to do. I'm not avoiding this because of maybe emotional or fear based reasons. I'm just straight up not taking action. And so that was the morning I finally asked, what if it's biological? And what if my brain won't initiate a task because of neurochemistry? And in particular, is this dopamine at play? And it was actually that journal entry that motivated me to look into getting a diagnosis. I had suspected for a couple of years, friends who had been diagnosed as adults who kind of gently suggested it might work. I also do have a genetic component. It is in my family with multiple family members. But I would always say to myself, well, even if I have it, it's not that severe. I have done so many things in my life and, never had a diagnosis. So what is the difference? But remember when I said sometimes it's not funny? I thought about all of those days. I call them paralysis days where I felt frozen, just unable to do things that I know how to do, things that are important. And I would just sit there and watch myself do nothing and just feel overwhelmed. So if I found out for sure whether I had ADHD, then at least it could open the door to more options for how I could manage it. And that was really this initiating factor. But it was also that journal entry that got me thinking in terms of logical, biological, and psychological. Instead of just binary, I started to think of it in three different ways. And that is what would later become the momentum formula or the basis for it. So, what is happening in the brain of an ADHD person that makes it hard to actually initiate a task? And for this, I want to come back to something I've shared it before, but it's the BMAP model. So, the habit expert BJ Fogg has this model he calls BMAP. And essentially, it is that behavior happens when you have the combination of motivation, ability, and a prompt. And if you're watching on video, I have a visual I'm going to show, but I will also describe this for audio. But essentially, you have your motivation levels, which can be high or they can be low. And you have your ability levels, which can also, it can be difficult to do or can be easy to do. And when it comes to taking action, the P is for prompt. Something has prompted us to take action. Whether you see something on a list or you realize, oh, I have to do this. There's some sort of prompt that is telling you it's time to initiate taking action. And in order to do that, you have to just meet a threshold. You will take action, the behavior will happen when you have the right level of motivation to cross the threshold based on how easy or difficult it is. So if something is really easy to do, you don't actually need a lot of motivation. You will simply be able to just meet that threshold and you will take action. If something's harder to do, then you might need a lot more motivation to cross that threshold and take action on it. And this is a really helpful way to think about why sometimes we can feel overwhelmed and not do it. However, in the ADHD brain, sometimes even something that is really easy to do, you can still just be sitting here under the threshold and just not crossing that threshold. And so the brain doesn't have enough dopamine. That dopamine is involved with sort of wanting and seeking, and it's part of the reward pathway of the brain. And so this can drive behavior. And if you don't have enough dopamine in your brain, if it's the baseline is too low, you're not going to cross that threshold and you won't take action. And so it's really helpful to consider what does motivate an ADHD brain, because it's not that you can't do anything. In fact, there's a thing called hyperfixation or hyperfocus that people with ADHD experience, where if something is really interesting or driving curiosity, or they're just this fascination, or maybe it's really challenging, they can actually concentrate deeply on something and time can just pass. They can actually get so absorbed in it that nothing else happens. And something that is very, very interesting, challenging, satisfying, these are the types of things that will easily cross the threshold and drive action. But when something is important just on its own, that's not enough to cross the threshold. So I think it's a really important thing to understand where if you are not taking action and you don't have enough dopamine, you're literally, your brain is not firing enough. And so this frustration, these paralysis days that I would experience were happening because I was just not meeting that threshold. And something simply being important just wasn't cutting it. And so that's where I started to really think about what do we do when we know this about ourselves? And that's really where the formula starts to come in. When I say that there's a biological issue, when it comes to ADHD, there's literally neurochemistry in your brain. It's not enough for you to trigger the action. And so when you understand that about yourself, then you can say, okay, how can I adjust how I work, my mode, so that I can start to initiate action? How do I cross that threshold? And there are multiple strategies that you can use. So the more you understand your brain, then the more you can start to test out and experiment with what works really well for your brain. Now, when I talk about mode in particular, I like to talk about biology, environment, expectations, and preferences. And let's use an example of a body doubling. So body doubling is a productivity technique that is popular with ADHD, but works for other people. But that is being able to better focus when you are surrounded by other people who are also focused on their work. And this can be in person. So I love working at a coffee shop or a co-working space because other people around me are working and it helps me focus. This could also be virtual online. I really love attending virtual co-working sessions where we all just quietly work together, but it gets my butt in the chair because I have committed to showing up for this call. That's the thing that my brain responds to. Now, expectations. I've talked a lot around this idea that sometimes when no one else is involved, if it's just the thing you say you're going to do, you might put it off and you might delay it. Now, for someone with ADHD, if it's important, but it's not urgent, there's no one waiting on it, it will just keep getting shoved off to the side. So, using outer accountability, having other people be involved, that's another way that you can cross that threshold and you can make it not just important, but also add some urgency, add those expectations, which can be enough to drive that behavior. And then also, I do want to acknowledge the role of biology when it comes to strategies like medication. This is something you would work with a professional. I'm not giving any kind of advice. I just know that this is an option or strategy for people with ADHD. And the way I think of medication is that it almost just brings down that threshold. It makes it easier to cross. And so that if something is important, that's actually enough to cross over the threshold and take action on it. And it's something that I've explored working with my healthcare team, and I did notice a difference with it, and it's not necessarily right for everyone. And I have to use a combination of things. But these are all strategies that are about understanding how you work so you can address these biological changes. So ultimately, when someone says, does the momentum formula work for people with ADHD? I say yes. It is all about understanding your brain, how your brain works, and then having a toolkit, having strategies that will adapt and help you to initiate and take action if that's what's happening. Now, the other thing is when you've got yourself set up with these strategies and it's still not working, well, then that might suggest that you need to look into more logical. Maybe it's a logical challenge where you actually don't have all the pieces and you need to work on that. But it could also be psychological. I mean, there are times where I genuinely am avoiding something because of trying to avoid discomfort, trying to avoid any negative consequences. But if I'm using the strategies that I know work with my brain, that drive enough motivation to be able to take action, then I'm setting myself up for success. And then any other troubleshooting around that, I can do this. Now, something I do want to address with the ADHD brain is that they tend to respond well to curiosity, like genuine interest can really drive taking action. Challenges can be motivating of, okay, I'm gonna rise to the challenge. It kind of drives that behavior. If something's new, some novelty is really helpful. And then also urgency, which we already talked about. I want to address the novelty one because sometimes a strategy is going to work for a while, but as it starts to lose its novelty, then you can start to struggle. And that's why I do also like having multiple strategies that are available, multiple ways to troubleshoot. And depending on the type of action you're taking, some strategies might work better than others. And regardless of who you are, whether you have ADHD or not, I think being curious about how you work, what fits, what feels natural is a constant evolution of figuring that out trial and error because when you find something that works, you are setting yourself up to be able to sustain something, to show up over and over again, and ultimately it can help you to find and keep your momentum.